Hope you're doing well. I'm just today recording this in our bedroom at home. Some of you have kind of expressed a preference for different types of places where I record them. Some of you prefer it when I'm here, some of you prefer it when I'm outside. It really just depends on the time of day I happen to be recording, and the place that at that time of day I think I am least likely to be disturbed by dogs or children or whoever. I know some of you are keen to keep a track on how the painting is going, so you can see there's been an extra coat. So anyway, I know some of you were concerned about that or interested in that. Anyway, looking forward to at some point when we get back to something resembling normality to having you around and getting together again. I'm missing you all. And I know we're all missing connecting with each other. And I'll just emphasize what I keep saying in the WhatsApp messages. If you want to chat about anything, do please get in touch with me. There are different ways we can make that happen, and I have been making that happen with various people. So if you want to chat about something, or if you just want to connect with another human being, just get in touch. I'd love to hear from you. And if you've got stuff that you'd like the community to pray for or give thanks for, this is a thing we'd share in church together on a normal Sunday morning in our news slot, then let me know. And I'd love to share that with the community by WhatsApp. It's not ideal, but it is something we can do at this time. Similarly, if you want to record a reading, then let me know, as Bim has done today, and thanks, Bim, for that. We're looking at the life of Abram, as it's recorded for us in Genesis at the moment. And last week we looked at God's call of Abram and how he was called to go from one place, the place that he had always been at 75 years old, and go to the new place, the promised land that God was leading him to. And we consider that he was travelling light. Of course, he took with him his culture, his life experience, and a few other things, of course, but little else. And he travelled light to this new place that God was calling him, even though he didn't know where it was or what it would look like or what it would be like when he got there. And he met God in that new place. He built an altar there, and he worshipped where he met God in the new place, in the new way, not in the way he always had done. And that raised, as we said last week, some questions for us as individuals and as a church. What do we leave behind, and what do we take with us into whatever the future holds for us? What does the future look like? At the moment, the answer to all those questions is we don't know. There is much that is uncertain about the future. And we don't know what the answers to these questions will be. And as I've said before, I have no agenda or sense of what I think should happen particularly. It doesn't mean throwing everything out and starting all over again. But we may need to think about how we adapt and exist as individuals and as a church community in the future that lies ahead of us, in the light of all we've been experiencing over the last weeks and months. There's much that is uncertain. So in the midst of that uncertainty, we come to the second half of Genesis chapter 12 that Bim read for us just now. And Abram hits a problem. There is a famine. The land that he has found himself in does not provide for him and his family what he wants and needs. So he takes the decision to move with his family to Egypt, where he thinks that he and they have a better chance of surviving this crisis. Now, Abram is concerned. He thinks the Egyptians will kill him so that they can keep Sarai, his wife, to themselves. So he instructs Sarai to tell a lie, say, "You're my sister," for his sake, so that he survives. And it's interesting to note that in doing so, he makes no mention of concern for his wife, for Sarai. He's only thinking about himself. Now, of course, it's understandable that he'd be concerned about himself, but he doesn't stop to think about what it might be like for Sarai should what Abram says he thinks will happen happens, that he is killed. What would it be like for Sarai to be essentially forcibly adopted at this late age into a foreign culture and family? To be forced into marriage, as Sarai assumes will happen. Abram is only thinking about himself. And that's not a great motive. Now, of course, God doesn't want Sarai to be treated like this, as Abraham has been planning. And God expresses his judgment towards Egypt by sending diseases as a sign of that, a foreshadowing of what will happen in the Exodus. The Egyptian rulers work out what has happened, that they are experiencing judgment because of this, and they send them all away, Abram, Sarai, and everybody. Abram's plan has failed. He was proved wrong. He wasn't killed when they found out Sarah was his wife. And he and his whole family lose out because of this self-preserving lie that Abram made Sarai tell. Who knows what would have happened had everything been above board and Abram and Sarai just told the truth. Maybe they would have just been allowed to live as family in that land for the duration of the famine. Abram's assumptions about this foreign alien culture were proven to be, at least in part, unfounded and untrue. It's a sorry, sordid affair, isn't it? And even by the very different standards of Abram's day, he seems to me to act like some sort of patriarchal misogynist who's only concerned for himself, not his wife. And he's found out for it. You know, it's easy to sometimes dress up these parts of Scripture, but let's be clear, of course, that just because something is portrayed, just because we read the story about something that happens in Scripture, it doesn't mean that those actions are necessarily approved of by God. Abram here treats his wife appallingly. And Abram suffers for it, as of course does Sarai. God subverts the misogyny of that culture, and he expects better of his people, as does God in all eras, whatever time we live in. God doesn't expect his people to conform to the values of the day in terms of anything, really, particularly in this sense, in terms of how people, particularly women, were being treated. And he doesn't expect us either, it's worth noting, just to do enough, just to do as much as maybe the law commands or our culture expects. He expects us to be better. I think of the memorial service that was held at St. Peter's this week for the man Neville, who from our Thursday night community, who died a week and a half or so ago. Our community wanted to go the extra mile to honour Neville's life and give thanks for him and to express support for his family. We are all expected by God to do a little bit better than our culture expects of us. I think of how we continue to treat women in our society. I think of how we think about the poor and those who have less than us. I think about how many of us pay our domestic workers perhaps less than we should, and maybe don't pay them holiday pay and maybe aren't paying them at the moment. We're expected to do better than the culture of our days suggests and expects. And here's the interesting thing to note in the light of all that. God's call on Abram, despite all these failings that we've seen in him in this little time already, God's call on Abram remains the same. He and Sarai are going to have a child in their very old age. And as we'll see over the next few weeks, they mess up more than once in how they respond to God's promise and God's call. But the call remains the same. God doesn't count Abram and Sarai out of his plans because they mess up and get things wrong. I, like many of you, most of you probably, have heard more sermons in my life than I can possibly remember. Very few over the years stand out, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's good, I think, sometimes to use the analogy of a meal for a sermon. You don't remember what you had for lunch on the third Tuesday of June 1999, do you? Well, you probably don't. But if you hadn't had a meal then, you would have been hungry. You would have noticed it. Anyway, my point is that one of the very few sermons that I do recall was preached over 20 years ago by a clergyman called Mike Lloyd, who's now actually the principal of the Theological College in England. And he preached on the genealogy of Jesus as it's presented in the book of Ruth. Just that list of names. And it's such an uninspiring text to read. It's one of those that if you're reading the book of the Bible through or the whole Bible through, it's one of those you're very tempted to skip. But it was a gripping, brilliant sermon, and he went through each individual in that genealogy and pointed out how each individual in that genealogy of Jesus had messed up in different ways, or was morally compromised in some way, or whatever it was, or had failed. And his point was that those names are still recorded in the Bible as part of the heritage of Jesus, and part of the way God worked to bring Jesus to our world for us. And his concluding line that I still remember well over 20 years later is this: I don't want to hear any of you say ever again that you are not good enough for God. It's really stayed with me, and it's something I allow to echo in my head time and time again. And I think it's something that each of us need to take to heart, and that Abram's story reminds me of. Of course, the grace and the goodness of God that we're talking about here, and not counting anyone out of his plans or to be used by him, doesn't give us license to do whatever we like. If we're thankful to somebody, if we love somebody, we'll try to treat them well and do what is good for them. How much more so with God? Hence the disciplines of confession and repentance, and remembering that we receive forgiveness and making amends where it's possible to do so and wise to do so, and learning from what we get wrong and moving on. But this is the central point. God counts nobody out of his will, out of his promises, out of his call because of things they get wrong. Don't let your past count you out of God's future, because God doesn't let that. We don't know what the future holds. This is such an uncertain time. And you may be sitting there thinking, as I have done to myself over recent weeks at low moments, God can't possibly use someone like me. If people knew what I think some days, or what I've done, they won't want to use me in this new future. Now, of course, sometimes we may need to change bits about ourselves and allow God to heal us and shape us a bit. But we all have a role and a calling in God's future, no matter what our past was like, no matter our age, no matter our state of health, no matter our bank account, no matter where we live, no matter what our family history was like, and so on and so on and so on. Which is why it's okay for us to be honest and appropriately vulnerable with people you trust, or you can do so with me. It will help others as you do so, and it will help you to move on. If that's true for individuals, it's the same for us as a church at St. Peter's. Like every church, we're good at some things and we're not so good at others, because we're a church of human beings, like every church is. But we and all churches have a role in God's future if we seek to embrace it. And nothing in our sense of who we are, our numerical size, our church's bank balance, our past, our building, whatever it is, none of that can count us out of God's future. We need to embrace it and lay it at his feet and say, use this, who we are as individuals and as a church, in the future, as you have done in different ways in the past. So let's embrace this in our attitudes towards ourselves and in our attitudes towards others. Let's seek to be a community of grace. As we've experienced this grace that God gives to us, let us extend it towards ourselves and to others. Maybe we count others out of being used by God or being welcomed by God. And we probably actually, maybe even subconsciously do this because deep down we think God can't use us, me, because of the things that I hide. Maybe we're a bit like the elder brother in the parable of the prodigal son who just seems resentful when the prodigal son is welcomed home. And there's something in the elder brother that he hasn't allowed to be healed or embraced and graced by God, which means he's unable to fully welcome the other one home. And maybe that's why some of us think that God can't welcome people like that, whatever that is in your or my case. I'm struck that over this period of lockdown, stuff comes up for us. This enforced time with a few people or by ourselves may have bubbled to the surface of our consciousness, relational things in our interactions with people that we're with, or just as we're by ourselves, we may have been remembering and paying attention to stuff that is personal to us or from our past that in the normal busyness of life we wouldn't allow to come to the surface. And we may be saying to ourselves, gosh, look at me. If this sort of person can't be used by God in the future, what a terrible person I am. Well, if you're thinking that, then be assured that most of us are thinking that about ourselves, not about you, about ourselves. So let's deal with those things. Let's get help to deal with those things and remember that as we get help with them, these things don't count us out. They just make us more available to be used by God, his power made perfect in our weakness, as I keep saying. I've said before that one of the most common accusations levelled at Christians is that we are hypocrites. People see the high moral standards that we talk about and see that so many of us don't live up to them. And it is true. Christians are hypocrites because God only calls and sends hypocrites, people who know they're hypocrites. Which is why we need to be wary of moralising and this kind of what easily comes across as a kind of a hard judgmental attitude, especially to those outside of the church, and telling them that this is how life should be lived. Because of course we know that we can't measure up to these standards, so why should we expect anyone else to? Doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a moral stance, of course, but we need to be careful how we express it to others as well as to ourselves. Rather than moralizing, maybe we should be modeling and experiencing and talking about amongst ourselves and to those outside of the church this forgiven grace in our attitudes to ourselves, to the church, and to those outside the church. That we know we can't be the people that we want to be in our own strength and power. And that we, like everybody else, are people who need almost constant forgiveness and grace. But that nothing counts us out of being used by God in the present and indeed the future. The future is coming. And we need to be ready for it. In all the changes it might ask of us, and in all the things it might call us to hold on to, and to keep the same. And part of that getting ready for the future is allowing ourselves to live and breathe in the glorious truth that God doesn't count you out of his new eternal community and as a part of his plans. So I invite you to together embrace the grace of God for you, to drink deeply from that grace, to begin a journey if you haven't already begun it, of forgiveness and healing and restoration, and an awareness that you are not discarded from God's community and from God's plans. And that as you embrace that grace, so you become a vehicle of that grace for others who do not yet know God, that need that grace and to drink from it just as deeply as you and I do. In these few moments of quiet, I invite you, if you're with others right now, maybe to talk about together or by yourself in silence, just to think about those things that maybe you've buried a little deeply, that you think God would cause God to push you away, would cause God to discard you. And in doing so, remember that nothing counts you or anybody else. Nothing that you have done or said or thought can discard you from God's present and God's future for you and for us. Receive God's grace. Drink deeply from it so that you may be healed and so that you may become a vehicle of it for others.